Hello, I'm Holly Nielsen and I'm a PhD candidate at Royal Holloway, University of London, and I'm going to be presenting my paper, British Board Games circa 1900 to 1960, The Muteness of Objects and Locating Play. So from the late 19th century to the mid 20th century, and arguably beyond, board games from chess to snakes and ladders were a hugely popular pastime and entertainment provided to children. They were a consistent leisure staple through a period of huge social and cultural change. Using the family life and work experience before 1918 oral history collection, developed by Paul Thompson and held by the UK Data Service, we can see that by the Edwardian period, board games had become a common site of domestic ludic interaction. Ludic, just in case anybody isn't aware, is a kind of another word for play or playful. So 230 of the 453 transcribed interviews in this oral history collection mentioned a board game by name. That's over 50% of the interviews. So the interviewees not only mention board games in their own childhood, but they talk about playing them with their own children and grandchildren, allowing us to see a generational continuity and broaden the potential periodization. So drawing on games published between 1900, from around 1900 to around 1960, this paper will explore what we can learn from these sources and the limits of this knowledge. It will argue that while we must avoid seeing designer intention as reception, by using supplementary sources and an adapted framework used in modern game analysis, we can begin to locate the players of these games and their experiences. So board games can be a complex source to analyze. They are at once texts, work of art, pieces of material culture, and rule-based items. The use of board games as a source fits within the recent historiographical willingness to look beyond the textual sources and utilize interdisciplinary methodologies. Just as Frank Trentman notes the unfixed boundaries of objects in material history, what a board game is can be a constantly shifting definition. They can be an item of play, a site of socialization, a memento, a piece of media, and anything in between. Rules can be changed, disregarded, or lost altogether. The playful quality of a game does not rest within the game itself, but is found in the player. A game enables a player to act ludically. While the provided rules may give us some insight into how a potential play scenario could unfold, the infinite variables of human interaction mean that to try and analyze the play itself from just the game is restrictive. The game and the play that happens with and around it are separate but connected things. What can be read from the material games themselves is not so much the play that took place, but rather the intended play of the game designer. Through combining the materiality of the games with ego sources, such as oral histories and letters, we can begin to see some of the potential play experiences of players using these games. So to help understand and locate play, I have been using an adapted version of the Mechanics, Dynamics, Aesthetics, or MDA framework. So a framework that was used for modern game analysis that I believe can be usefully adapted for historical research. The MDA framework was developed and presented by Robin Hunick and Marc LeBlanc and Robert Zubek at the Game Developers Conference in San Jose between 2001 and 2004. The framework was originally developed with the purpose of easing both the development and research of games and bridging the gap between the two by introducing a cohesive methodology that can be applied to a broad class of games and game research. So although the framework has largely been used for the analysis of modern games, it is equally as useful for historical research, if adapted, and helps us to understand the components of game playing, allowing a more comprehensive analysis and helping to understand both the game and the gameplay. So the MDA framework consists of three lenses which look at games, all separate but causally linked. So mechanics are the components of a game, the rules, restrictions, and win conditions. Dynamics are how players interact with these rules. They can create strategies, adapt them or even ignore them completely. Aesthetics are the emotional responses evoked in the player. So if chess is taken as an example, the mechanics of chess would be its rules, where the pieces can move, the number of pieces allowed on the board, and how the board itself is set out. The dynamics would be the strategies developed by the player to win the game. And finally, the aesthetics lens When it comes to chess, could be anything from satisfaction at executing a strategy or frustration at losing a piece. So Huenick, LeBlanc, and Zubek originally stated that the purpose of aesthetics was to move away from the uninformative words such as fun. They included 8 taxonomies of aesthetics. So sensation, games as sense pleasure; fantasy, games as make-believe; narrative, game as drama; challenge, game as obstacle course; fellowship, game as social framework; discovery, game as uncharted territory; expression, game as self-discovery; and submission, game as pastime. They also state that this list is not exhaustive. So nearly all of the board games that I analyze during my PhD include the aesthetic component of fellowship. However, to truly analyze the emotional responses to a game and play experience, more nuance is needed in this aspect. This is particularly true as not all play experiences are positive ones, although there may be an assumption of positivity simply because of the words game and play. Play was often a site of tension. Play could highlight friction in interpersonal relationships. It could be unfulfilling. It could be performative. Play itself can be a contentious issue within broader society. For example, the moral panic about the inclusion of dice in board games, which resulted in a huge panic about bringing gambling into the domestic sphere. So while the original use of the MDA framework was primarily for game designers to describe the desirable emotional responses evoked in the player, when adapting this framework for historical analysis of games and play, it is important to note that the emotional responses were not always desirable. So this paper is separated into 3 sections where I'm going to look at mechanics and dynamics and aesthetics. So starting with mechanics. To learn about the mechanics of the games, then a number of sources can be used. Firstly, the games themselves are a key part. The games can be a variety of materials. Sometimes they consist of only the board of the board game. The counters and dice that may be needed to play were expected to be provided by the player. Occasionally, the games consisted of playing pieces, cards, tokens, as well as the actual board. So along with the board, the most important aspect is the rules, which are most commonly either stuck to the board or in a separate accompanying booklet or pamphlet. Another group of sources that can provide the mechanics lens of the analysis framework are patents and patent announcements in trade journals, primarily the journal I use, which is the Games and Toys Trade Journal. So these patents allow us to see the rules and the boards of the board games, even if the actual boards themselves have been lost or can't be located in archives. So what can be learned purely from these types of sources? We can of course see the kind of basics of the mechanics, the rules, limitations, and prescriptions of the game. But another key aspect when historicizing is designer intention. So from the content, we can tell if the game was intended to be didactic and the messages the designers intended to promote. So for example, the game entitled Recruiting for Kitchener's Army, retailing for 6p, was unapologetically direct with its message of encouraging recruitment. It shows a kind of a mechanical rhetoric. Recruiting for Kitchener's Army was published by Valentine's and Sons. The exact date of publishing is unknown, but it was most likely during the first pushes for recruitment upon the outbreak of war in 1914. Quite a few game designers kind of jumped on the bandwagon of creating very nationalistic, patriotic games such as this, and quite a few made quite a lot of money off it. So the aim of this particular game is to progress through the board, which is an undetailed map of the United Kingdom. The player starts at Sign the Pledge in Killarney, along the way recruiting people from major cities, which are represented by counters or beans, and landing at the end point of Dover. So recruitment is depicted as inevitable and vital to win. There are no spaces that actively stop the recruitment, only ones that delay it. The spaces that delay it are teeth defective, leading to dentist, smoker's heart, resulting in give it up, and underdeveloped, resulting in physical drill, which reflected the growing preoccupation with the state of the nation at the time. So each problem for recruitment has an easy solution provided by the game. The worst spaces are simply entitled drink, but even this only leads the player back to sign the pledge. The race game formula was utilized for propaganda purposes and for publishers to capitalize on this wave of nationalistic sentiment, as I said before, which was rapidly spreading through the country during the period. So to supplement this analysis of mechanical rhetoric, information about the designers can also help to understand some of these potential intentions. So, for example, Jill Sheffrin's extensive work on the Darton family, who are a family published a wide variety of board games and other educational ephemera in the late 18th and early 19th century. Jill Sheffrin's work of locating a huge number of personal documents belonging to the family highlighted how the family's Quaker beliefs impacted the messages they included in their games. So we have to acknowledge it's not just the intentions of the designer, but how their lived experiences and identities inform the games they design. So these games can also be used to view assumptions of gender, race, class, and social roles. They can tell us about age relations, what material was viewed as appropriate for children, what was deemed as important for a child to learn. As with any other historical text, they require a careful reading and should be set within the historical context. So advertising material from newspapers, magazines, and trade journals also allow us to see designer and publisher intention. We can view the intended market, if there was a gender or class element to their marketing, whether they were aiming for an adult audience, parents, or as perhaps later in the period, directly to children themselves as consumers. It must also be acknowledged what these sources cannot show us. As Ludmilla Jordanova highlighted in her chapter, Objects of Knowledge, a historical perspective on museums, these games on their own, quote, do not themselves indicate who bought them, why they did so, how the games were used, whether children enjoyed them, or what impact they had on those that used them. So here the MDA framework highlights that these sources show us the mechanics lens of analysis, but not the dynamic or aesthetic. The play and the social context of that play is not found in the games, rules, or advertising material, just as the history of reading is not found in the books alone. So to locate the dynamic and aesthetic, we must look to a wider range of sources. So now I'm going to address dynamics. So to be able to understand the dynamics of board games and the play happening with them, we must look to sources beyond the material games, their rules, and their designers. The dynamic aspect needs to be broadened for historical use. So here it will not just be used to understand players' interactions with the rules, but the presence of the game in players' lives, who they played with, and where and when. So one type of source useful for this is oral history interviews. So Mrs. Webster, born in 1891 in Liverpool, remembers how her father, a carter by trade, used the structured play of board games to diffuse sibling arguments and distract the children, making childcare easier. She remembered, quote, when we were at home, if anybody started making a bid, Dad'd say, get the Ludo out, go on you two and play Ludo, and you two get the Snakes and Ladders and play and keep you occupied. So this the expansive collection of records that I mentioned earlier, the family life and work experience oral history collection, allows us to see how familial dynamics could manifest around these games. So letters and newspapers can also be a good source for understanding play dynamics and the role of these games in players' lives. So for example, Donald Miller from Heatherset was so enamored with the game Snakes and Ladders that he wrote a letter to the Lowestoft Journal, published on the 4th of June 1910, answering a question about favorite games by stating Snakes and Ladders was his. Quote, I think it is a very nice game and a lot of people like to play it. He then situated Snakes and Ladders as a game of familial ludic interaction. Quote, I very often get father and mother to have a game with me, as I am not fortunate enough to have any brothers and sisters. The dynamics of play with board games can also be viewed through the marginalia and modifications made to the material by the players. So as a sort of preliminary example of how these marginalia can be used to view how a player adapts the game to their play, I will quickly look at a board game called The Prince's Quest, which was published by Roberts Brothers circa 1910. So at some point, this game was in the possession of a child called Joan. And we know this because she wrote her name very largely on the back of the board. And on two of the provided playing pieces, which are two princes representing the players on the board, Joan wrote very carefully on both sides, mother on one and father on the other. So could these have been her parents playing pieces when they played with her? Did Joan associate these pieces with her parents? Of course, it is impossible to know of so little evidence, but what is important to emphasize is that Joan brought to this game her own personal layer of meaning, one not found in the rules. The game allows us to this game allows us to glimpse at personal layers that may actively or subconsciously resist the original purpose of the game. These games can be biographical objects. So another source that allows us to view the dynamics of play, often with precision in terms of how players interact with the mechanics of a game, are newspapers and sport magazine chess columns. So these columns reported on chess matches, printed announcements of future tournaments and events, and gave technical and instructional advice to players, and occasionally espoused the virtue of chess as a, quote, rational recreation. So from these columns, we can see a growing language of strategy and numerical systems being understood by those who played and followed competitive chess. A growing culture of chess playing can be witnessed by the quantity of these columns, which peaked between 1860 and 1880, but continued into the 20th century. So the idea of the amateur player in comparison to the professional or the expert can be seen in the reporting of chess. So while the dynamics tell us about the game's systems, rules, and designer intention, and the dynamics tell us about player interactions with the games, a key aspect that these two lenses do not necessarily address are the emotional reactions to the play, the aesthetics part of the MDA framework. So now look at the aesthetics. So all histories are full of these more emotional aspects of play, particularly as when talking about board games, people nearly always talk about who they played these board games with. So histories of emotions have been very helpful in framing this. These emotions are contingent, they're often complex, they are informed by experiences, variables, relationships, and more. The play experience is heavily informed by the emotional lives of the players. It is why no two play experiences are ever the same. So Mrs. Robson, born in 1900 in Dumfries, Scotland, remembered purchasing a Ludo board, with her own savings and playing with her older sister, Ken. I bought a Ludo board and it was only sixpence. I had to save up for it but I got a Ludo and it was only sixpence, and many a time we used to sit and play Ken. She then recalled occasionally being able to persuade her mother into playing with her and her sister, but if her father was present, he would stop any playing. Quote, "If he'd been in, it would have been a case of coming out and saying, 'What's going on,' and dumping you. And that was the finish, and that spoiled the whole thing." So Mrs. Robson's experience shows that the presence of play in a household was not static. Interactions relied on social dynamics. They could be fleeting and unstable. Despite this, a ludic interaction with her sister and mother was desired, and time and space was found, and Ludo was her way to initiate it. So not all interactions with board games were from children. Mrs. Jones was born in 1898 in Sollyminid, Festiniog. I'm sorry to any Welsh speakers for my pronunciation. Her father was a butcher who delivered meat from a horse and cart, and her mother was a servant for various local farms before getting married and having 9 children. So Mrs. Jones recounted that despite having very few toys and games available, her grandfather was so obsessed with playing Ludo that it led to her father banning his children from playing all board games. So, quote, "There was very little of anything like games, but I do remember that my grandfather used to like playing Ludo. He'd play Ludo all through the winter, even when there was a visitor there. And one evening my father went over there and my father asked my grandfather questions, but he wouldn't answer. He was too busy with this game. And my father got angry at this, and consequently he went against all games. He was angry at all games because, you see, my grandfather was too keen on this Ludo game. And of course we couldn't play after that." So this memory is a reminder to historians that although games and play may have been present in a household, they do not necessarily equate to positive encounters and emotional closeness. Games could be a site of tension and disagreement. So another source that can be used to understand the aesthetic and dynamic experience of play happening around these games are autobiographies. Daisy Cowper, born in 1890, recalled in her autobiography how her brothers Harry and Bert would take over the kitchen table to play Boer war games, and her frustration at being left out of her brother's war play. Daisy described how she, quote, loved to hang over the battlefield like some avenging deity, although she quickly makes clear, quote, but always on the side of the British. Even a retaliating, annoyed little sister apparently could not transcend the nationalism built into games of war. So despite her brothers protesting her presence and declaring that she, quote, ruined every engagement, she would blow away the paper soldiers with her breath and scatter the game. Daisy found a way of engaging with the game, much to her delight and her brother's annoyance, but she was an outside, unwanted feminine presence in a masculine space. So a lot of the sources that tackle the aesthetic lens of analysis are people remembering their play experiences rather than documentation that occurred during or just after the play. This means such sources should be treated with that in mind. There are methodological discussions to be had about this, and also the practice of repurposing oral histories. However, there is also potential benefit to it as time can allow the person to reflect and see patterns and gain a perspective on their own experiences that interviews done during play would not be able to capture. So, for example, Miss Foley, born between 1881 and 1891, lived in Bolton with her five siblings and her mother, who worked in a cotton mill, who was a single parent after her father left when she was young. Miss Foley remembered this, quote, yes, they always had a draft board and the boys were very keen on drafts and dominoes. Dominoes were often played, but Mother and I and Emily often played snakes and ladders in, you know, the cold winter evenings when it was too dark to do much else. And of course, I always wanted Mother to win because I never liked winning myself and I used to dodge horribly. You know how you got your counter on the top of a ladder and you had to go down to the bottom. Well, now, I always used to maneuver that when she should get home, you know, the winning post was home. And I used to look at her face, you see. I don't know whether she knew that I was dodging or not, but I deliberately did it because I used to love seeing her smile, and it used to pain me as a little child. I was so sensitive, her sad face. She then continues in the interview and concludes that her mother probably did know she was letting her win and that her smile was because her child was trying to make her smile, not because she was winning. So any historian who looks at play or any sort of potentially ephemeral experience will highlight just how difficult it is to locate. But by using this adapted MDA framework as a guideline for analysis, we can start to unpick what can be and what cannot be accessed through various sources. It helps us not just focus on the objects of play, my own focus being the board games, but it helps to understand them as material items with which the spatial, temporal, and emotional realities of play took place. Thank you for listening.